We're continuing our study of the people of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. Today we see faith on display among more of the judges of Israel. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 32 mentions 4 of the judges as examples of faith for us. Gideon, whom we discussed last week, and also Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, who we'll discuss this week. So as we move on and we consider them, just a reminder of something we mentioned last week that we'll quickly be reminded of, and that is these men were not perfect. The Hebrew writer simply commends their faith as worthy examples to us. And we need to remember this fact even more today, maybe than last week. So as we get into our study, we again will be focusing on Barak, Samson, and Jephthah. And let's begin with Barak. Barak we find as 4th judge of Israel in Judges chapter 4. And in verse 1 it says, the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. That vicious cycle we referred to last week. In verse 2, so the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan. And verse 3 says, the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. And then in verse 6, we see where God sent a message to the prophetess Deborah to Barak. The message was, has not the Lord God of Israel commanded? Go and deploy troops at Mount Tabor. Now, Barak's response in verse 8 was, if you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. And at first glance, Barak may seem like a better example of a lack of faith. But let's consider it a little deeper. If you back up to verses 2 and 3, we read there that Jabin had 900 chariots of iron. And verse 7 again mentions his chariots and his multitude. Now, we don't know how large this multitude was, but in 2 Chronicles 14, verse 9, when Zerah had 300 chariots, and in comparison to Jabin's 900, he also had 1,000,000 men. So here we have God calling Barak to go against this army of 900 chariots of iron and a multitude of men. How many men will Barak have? Well, verse 6, God told Barak to take with you 10,000 men. And later we will learn in the next chapter, chapter 5, that not a shield or spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. So the Israelites, even though he had 10,000 men, were most likely unarmed or very ill-equipped, especially going against 300 chariots and who knows how many men in this multitude. But in spite of the odds seeming to be against them, what other message did God have for Barak? Verse 6, he continued, and I will deliver him into your hand. 10,000 men versus chariots, or 300 chariots in his multitude. And what did Barak do? Well, we see in verse 10, he went up with 10,000 men under his command. In verse 14, then Deborah said to Barak, up, for this day in which the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hand, has not the Lord gone out before you? So Barak went out from Tabor with 10,000 men following him. Barak had enough faith in God to leave the security in the mountain from the chariots to meet the chariots on the plain at the river. I mean, think about that. As long as the men stayed in the mountains, the chariots couldn't reach them. But they have faith to go down out of the mountains, away from their safety, with God on their side, and meet the chariots where the chariots normally would function their best. Verse 15, we read that when Barak acted in faith, that God took care of the rest. And the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army with the edge of the sword before Barak. And verse 16 also indicates Barak's faith when it said Barak pursued the chariots and the army. While vastly outnumbered and under-equipped through the eyes of man, Barak had faith in the deliverance God said he would provide. And then as we continue to consider the judges, we also see Samson mentioned in Hebrews 11. And we go to Judges 13 to begin reading about Samson, the 13th judge of Israel. Now, he's probably one of the most questioned of all those listed in Hebrews 11 as examples of faith when we see some of the things of question in his life. But we read in Judges 13 and verse 1 that the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. Here we go again on that vicious cycle. But notice verse 5, where the angel of the Lord foretold Samson's birth and future to his mother. And he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. Now, notice that it wasn't going to be a complete deliverance, but Samson was going to be the beginning. It would be many more years before Israel would completely defeat the Philistines. But Samson was the one that God chose to begin this deliverance. And we see in later verses 24 and 25, so the woman bore a son and called his name Samson. And the child grew, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to move upon him at Mahaneh Dan, between Zorah and Eshtaol. Here we see the beginning of God's relationship with Samson, how he often moved him and came upon him to accomplish his will. And we go on to the next chapter. In chapter 14, we see in the first few verses where Samson chose a Philistine for a wife. Now in verse 3, we see his parents were not pleased by his decision, and rightfully so under most circumstances. We see several passages such as Exodus chapter 34 and Deuteronomy 7 where the Israelites were forbidden from marrying pagans. But Samson was persistent. And in the New King James it says that he said he was persistent because she pleases me well. Now the Young's literal translation and some others word it, for she is right in mine eyes. And a key verse we find in verse 4. But his father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord, that he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines. For at that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel. While we see several unorthodox things and things we may question in the life of Samson, we see that the Lord was involved and that the things that happened were according to his will. And here we find one of those occasions. One commentator wrote that the Lord, by a course of retributive proceedings, was about to destroy the Philistine power, and the means which he meant to employ was not the forces of a numerous army, as in the case of the preceding judges, but the miraculous prowess of the single-handed champion of Israel. In these circumstances, the provocation to hostilities could only spring out of a private quarrel, and this marriage scheme was doubtless suggested by the secret influence of the Spirit as the best way of accomplishing the intended result. Here we see, by faith in God's plan, Samson insisted on the foreign Philistine for his wife. Well, we see in the following verses 10 through 13 that at a feast, Samson presented a riddle to the Philistine men that they could not answer. And we see in verses 14 through 18 where they bribed his wife into getting the answer for them. This meant Samson owed them 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing, as we see back in verse 12. So how would Samson pay his debt? Well, verse 19 tells us, then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, and he went down to Ashkelon and killed 30 of their men, took their apparel, and gave the changes of clothing to those who had explained the riddle. So his anger was aroused, and he went back up to his father's house. Now here we see the way that Samson paid off what seemed to be a debt by further punishing the Philistines. Now notice that he returned home without his wife. As we come into chapter 15, we see that when he returned back to get his wife, that Samson was told that she had been given to someone else in the first few verses. In verse 3, Samson said to them, this time I shall be blameless regarding the Philistines if I harm them. And we see in beginning verse 4, then Samson went and caught 300 foxes, and he took torches, turned the foxes tail to tail, and put a torch between each pair of tails. When he had set the torches on fire, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines, and burned up both the shocks and the standing grain, as well as the vineyards and olive groves. Now, how did he do this, and how long did it take him? Well, we're not told, but obviously we can see God's hand being involved. In verse 6, the Philistines retaliated again, this time by burning Samson's wife and father-in-law, who, by the way, remember, were Philistines. So what did Samson do in return? Well, verse 7 said, he attacked them hip and thigh with a great slaughter. After this, verses 9 through 13, we see the Philistines went after him and got the men of Judah to hand Samson over to them, with which Samson went along. And what did he do when he got to the Philistines? Well, beginning verse 14, when he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting against him. Then the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that is burned with fire, and his bonds broke loose from his hands. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out his hand and took it, and killed 1,000 men with it. Now, after this great victory, notice to whom he gave the credit. In verse 18, he cried out to the Lord and said, you have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant. And then we see where God provided water for Samson. Killing 1,000 men with a jawbone would surely cause anyone to work up a thirst. And he did, and God met that thirst. And then in verse 20 it said he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. Gideon's army may have been reduced to 300 men, but at least he had an army. Here we find Samson single-handedly delivering Israel from the Philistines, one battle or one skirmish at a time. So we move on to chapter 16 now, and we see in the first 5 verses where Samson fell in love with a woman named Delilah, whom the Philistines convinced to find out the source of his strength. Well, verses 6 through 17, we see after being deceived multiple times, she pressed Samson to the point until he told her his strength was in his hair. In verses 18 through 20, we see where she had the Philistines come cut his hair, leaving him without strength. And in probably one of the saddest times in Samson's life, we find in verse 21, then the Philistines took him and put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza. They bound him with bronze fetters, and he became a grinder in the prison. Now, before things get too despondent, notice the next verse. However, the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaven. We continue in verses 23 through 26 to see where they brought Samson to the temple of their god Dagon to celebrate Dagon, according to them, delivering him into their hand. Now, where were they doing this celebration? Well, we see more about it in verse 27, that the temple was full of men and women. All the lords of Philistines were there. About 3,000 men and women on the roof watching while Samson performed. So what would happen? They bring Samson forward, celebrating victory over him? Well, God had other plans to work through Samson. As we continue, we see in verse 28, then Samson called to the Lord, saying, O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once. O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Well, God indeed answered his prayer. We see in verses 29 through 30, where Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars, which supported the temple, and he braced himself against them, one on his right and the other on his left. Then Samson said, Let me die with the Philistines. And he pushed with all his might, and the temple fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead that he killed at his death were more than he had killed in his life. Falling in love with Delilah may have been Samson's downfall, but it also became the downfall of many Philistines with him. Samson's faith consisted in his obeying the various impulses produced by the Spirit of God in his own mind. He demonstrated faith in God by relying on the strength which God gave him. When the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, he performed feats of faith which are without equal in human history. And so from there, we also notice the last judge that Hebrews mentions. We notice Jephthah, who we find in Judges chapter 11, the 9th judge of Israel. Now, he did not get off to such a good start in life. In verses 1 and 2, we see that since he was the son of a harlot, his half-brothers drove him out and said to him, You shall have no inheritance in our father's house, for you are the son of another woman. Well, Israel must have been unfaithful again, because we see in verse 4 that God allowed the people of Ammon to make war against Israel. And suddenly, the people had a change of heart about Jephthah. In verses 5 and 6, we see that the elders of Gilead went to Jephthah and asked him to come lead them against Ammon. Now, verses 7 through 9, after asking them why they were coming to him now, Jephthah asked a question that begins to demonstrate his faith. He asked them, "If you take me back home to fight against the people of Ammon, and the Lord delivers them to me, shall I be your head?" Well, we see in verses 10 through 11 that the people agreed, and he went with them. But he still sought God's guidance. And at the end of verse 11, we see that Jephthah spoke all his words before the Lord in Mizpah. We see in verses 12 and 13 that when Jephthah asked the king of Ammon why he had come to fight against Israel, the king said it was because Israel had taken the land from them when they came out of Egypt. Well, in verses 14 through 22, Jephthah replied that Israel gained possession of the land when the Lord delivered it into their hand. And his conclusion, based on this in verse 23, "And now the Lord God of Israel has dispossessed the Amorites from before his people Israel. Should you then possess it?" In other words, he said, you have no right to what God has given us. And in verse 24, he asked, "Will you not possess whatever Chemosh, your God, gives you to possess? So whatever the Lord our God takes possession of before us, we will possess." In other words, let your God give you whatever he wants. But our God has given us this land, and you're not going to take it from us. By faith in God, giving Israel the land, Jephthah stood against the king of Ammon. And then we see in verse 27, he said, "Therefore have I not sinned against you, but you wrong me by fighting against me. May the Lord, the judge, render judgment this day between the children of Israel and the people of Ammon." By faith, Jephthah was willing to let God settle the matter, and to do so by going to battle against Ammon. And what happened? Well, we drop down to verse 32. "So Jephthah advanced toward the people of Ammon to fight against them, and the Lord delivered them into his hands." By faith, Jephthah acted, and God delivered. When we see him, as we go on into the next chapter, chapter 12, when the men of Ephraim asked Jephthah why he fought Ammon without them, he replied to them, "My people and I were in a great struggle with the people of Ammon, and when I called you, you did not deliver me out of their hands. So when I saw that you would not deliver me, I took my life in my hands and crossed over against the people of Ammon, and the Lord delivered them into my hand." Now again, it was a great struggle that Jephthah had. And when you're in a great struggle, it's normally good to have as many people as possible on your side. But Jephthah knew that his deliverance did not depend on the men of Ephraim or anyone else being with him. His faith was in the Lord's deliverance, and we see that the Lord provided it for him. So I ask you, in who is your faith? Barak's ill-equipped army was nothing compared to that of Jabin's, but he had faith that God would deliver him, and God did. By faith, Samson single-handedly let God's Spirit work through him to provide deliverance against the Philistines. And Jephthah's faith in God, giving Israel the land, gave him the faith and courage to fight to maintain it. So I encourage you to learn from the judges and go forth in faith.